Good evening, dear travelers, and welcome back to Snug as a Bug. I'm Atticus, and I want to express my deepest gratitude to all of you who have subscribed and have been enjoying these ASMR sleep stories. Your support has inspired me to uncover more extraordinary tales for you. Tonight's adventure will transport us along the noble path of the samurai, beginning with the duel at Ganryū-jima, where two legendary swordsmen clash in a pivotal encounter. We will then delve into the tale of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the tragic hero whose honor has forever shaped history. Our journey continues with the legend of the swordsmith Muramasa, whose masterful craftsmanship harbors a sinister curse, and concludes with the ghostly warriors of Hōichi the Earless, whose music resonates deeply with both the living and the spirits. Let the ancient tales of courage, loyalty, and honor soothe your mind as you drift peacefully into a deep, restorative sleep. But before we begin our journey into the world of ancient Japan, let's take a moment to relax fully, releasing all the tension from your body and mind. Close your eyes gently and allow your body to settle into the bed, feeling fully supported and relaxed. Take a slow, deep breath in, and then exhale, letting go of any remaining tension. With each breath, feel yourself becoming lighter, your muscles releasing, and your mind quieting as you drift deeper into this state of calm. Now, imagine yourself standing at the edge of a tranquil forest where the towering bamboo sways gently in the evening breeze. The air is cool and crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and the distant hum of a temple bell. Above you, the sky glows a deep indigo, scattered with stars like glimmers of ancient wisdom, and before you, the path stretches into the heart of the forest, leading you into the mysteries of Japan's forgotten legends. The soft rustle of leaves beneath your feet echoes through the stillness, and as you walk deeper into the forest, the presence of the past surrounds you. You can feel the quiet strength of the samurai, their discipline and their honor, guiding your steps as you move further into this peaceful realm. The sound of a distant stream soothes you, its gentle current pulling you deeper into relaxation. Let the quiet beauty of this forest and the spirit of the samurai carry you away, easing your mind and body into a state of perfect stillness. You are safe, relaxed, and ready to explore the ancient stories of valor and wisdom as they guide you into the most peaceful and restful sleep. Now, let go and allow these tales to carry you on this journey through time as you drift peacefully into the night. The Duel at Ganryū-jima, Musashi vs. Kojiro, Chapter 1, The Challenge. In the early years of the Edo period, when the air was still thick with the echoes of Japan's warring past, two men stood at the pinnacle of their art, masters of the sword, whose names had already become legendary throughout the land. Yet, for all their renown, only one question remained unanswered: who was the greatest? It was this question that would be answered on the mist-shrouded shores of Ganryū-jima, an island nestled in the Kanmon Straits, where the waters of the inland sea met the vast ocean. It was the spring of 1612, and the cherry blossoms, which had begun to fall, painted the sky with soft petals, carried by the gentle wind, as if in homage to the warriors who had shaped Japan's destiny. The stillness of the season, with its fragile beauty, contrasted sharply with the storm of anticipation building in the hearts of samurai and commoners alike, who had come to witness the most anticipated duel in Japanese history. Miyamoto Musashi, the enigmatic ronin who had roamed the land, challenging and defeating warriors from every school and tradition, was a man of unparalleled skill. His name was whispered in reverence, and yet he was as much a mystery as a legend. He had no master and no single style. Musashi's approach to combat was as unorthodox as it was effective, blending strategy, adaptability, and a mental clarity that few could comprehend. On the other hand, Sasaki Kojiro, also known as Ganryu, was the epitome of precision, grace, and discipline. Known for his mastery of the nodachi, a sword longer than most men could wield with any efficiency, Kojiro had developed the infamous Tsubame Gaishi, the swallow reversal. It was a technique so swift and deadly that it was said to mimic the movement of a swallow's tail in flight, cutting down opponents before they even realized they had been struck. Though Musashi and Kojiro had never crossed paths before, their reputations preceded them. Both men had amassed followers and challengers, but deep down, they knew that their fates were intertwined. There could be no peace for either until they faced each other, sword, to determine who was truly the greatest swordsman in Japan. The challenge had been issued by Kojiro, whose ambition burned hotter than his pride. He had sought out Musashi, eager to claim victory over the only man who stood between him and the title of the greatest warrior in the land. Kojiro was a man who believed in honor, in the precision of form, in the power of mastering a single blade. His request was not born out of mere ego, but of a deep desire to prove, once and for all, that his skill was unmatched. Musashi, on the other hand, had no desire for such a title. His path was one of personal mastery, a journey inward as much as outward. Yet he accepted the challenge, knowing that every duel, no matter the opponent, was an opportunity to deepen his understanding of the way of the sword. And so the date was set for high noon, when the sun would cast its light evenly upon the island, and neither man could claim the advantage of shadow. As the days drew closer, word of the duel spread across the country. Samurai, merchants, and even peasants traveled from distant provinces to catch a glimpse of the battle. Ganryū-jima, once a quiet, unremarkable island, was now the stage for what would become one of the most famous duels in Japanese history. On the morning of the duel, the island was quiet, the waters of the Kanmon Straits lapping gently at its rocky shores. The sky was overcast, with clouds hanging low, casting a muted, silvery light over the scene. The air was thick with anticipation, yet serene, as though nature itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Chapter 2. The Arrival. Sasaki Kojiro arrived at Ganryū-jima early in the day, well before the appointed hour. Dressed in his finest hakama and carrying the famed nodachi, Monohoshi Zao, the drying pole, Kojiro stood tall and composed. His movements were measured, his demeanor calm, as though he were merely attending a formal ceremony rather than preparing for a fight to the death. His long blade gleamed in the dim light, and it was said that just by looking at it, one could feel the weight of the countless lives it had taken in Kojiro's hands. He stepped onto the rocky shore with the grace of a crane, his feet barely disturbing the pebbles beneath him. The few spectators who had managed to find vantage points along the shore watched in silence, some holding their breath, as Kojiro walked with purpose toward the designated duel area. Behind him, the sea stretched out endlessly, its waves calm yet full of latent power, much like the man who now stood poised on the beach. Kojiro's mind was sharp and focused, his body ready for the challenge ahead. He knew Musashi's reputation, knew that the ronin was unpredictable, that he often used unconventional methods to win his duels. But Kojiro was unshaken. He believed in the power of form, in the discipline of the sword, in the fact that the Tsubame Gaishi was an unbeatable technique. He had spent years perfecting it, refining it until it had become as much a part of him as his own breath. Yet, even as he waited, there was a part of him that felt the weight of destiny. This was not just a duel for honor or for pride. This was a meeting of fates, a moment in time that would be remembered for centuries. As he stood, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Musashi, he felt the subtle pull of something greater than himself, a force that had brought him here to this moment, as if the very universe had orchestrated this duel, weaving together the lives of these two warriors for a single fateful encounter. As the minutes ticked by, the stillness of the island grew heavier, and the sea seemed to mirror Kojiro's calm but expectant demeanor. The waves lapped against the shore in a rhythmic whisper, a backdrop to the tension that was beginning to mount among the spectators. Whispers of Musashi's whereabouts rippled through the gathered crowd, many of whom had traveled great distances to witness this clash of legends. Where was he? Would Musashi even show? Kojiro remained still, like a statue carved from stone, though beneath his calm exterior, his warrior's instinct sharpened with each passing moment. He could feel the sun rising higher in the sky, nearing the appointed time. The tension was like a coiled spring in the air, growing tighter with every second. And then, on the distant horizon, a small boat appeared. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible through the mist that still clung to the water. Slowly, it became clearer, a lone boat, cutting across the calm surface of the Kanman Straits with deliberate, unhurried strokes. Standing in the boat, his silhouette framed against the sky, was Musashi. The tension broke like a wave against the rocks as murmurs spread through the crowd. Musashi was coming. Kojiro's eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. He had heard of Musashi's habit of arriving late to unsettle his opponents, a psychological tactic as much as a display of indifference. But Kojiro would not be so easily rattled. His confidence, forged through years of discipline, remained unshaken. As Musashi's boat drew closer to the shore, his figure became more distinct. The ronin stood tall, his long hair unkempt and his clothing simple, in contrast to Kojiro's meticulous appearance. In his hand, Musashi held not a finely crafted sword, but what appeared to be a long, wooden oar, roughly carved into the shape of a weapon. The sight of it drew mixed reactions from the spectators. Some gasped in surprise, while others laughed nervously. A wooden sword? Was this some kind of joke? Kojiro's smirk deepened slightly, though his eyes remained cold. Was Musashi truly so arrogant as to think he could face the Monohoshi Zao with nothing but an oar? Musashi stepped out of the boat as it nudged against the shore, his bare feet touching the cool stones. He moved with the ease and grace of a man completely at peace with himself, his gaze calm as he regarded Kojiro. The contrast between the two was striking. Kojiro, a towering figure of poise and control, with his gleaming, deadly sword, and Musashi, a scruffy ronin with a makeshift weapon, looking as though he had just emerged from a night of meditation by the riverside. Yet beneath Musashi's casual appearance, there was an unmistakable air of power, a quiet, unspoken force that seemed to resonate from within him. Those who had fought him before spoke of this presence, of how Musashi could shift the flow of battle with nothing more than his stance, his gaze, or a subtle movement of his hand. And now, standing before Kojiro, Musashi exuded that same effortless confidence. Chapter 3. The Duel Begins. The air was thick with anticipation as the two warriors faced each other, the silence broken only by the gentle murmur of the sea. Kojiro's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his nodachi, the blade glinting ominously in the sunlight, while Musashi stood still, holding his wooden sword with the same casualness one might hold a walking stick. The duel had not yet begun in action, but it had already started in their minds. Both men were assessing each other, their every breath, every movement, weighed and calculated. Kojiro's eyes flicked over Musashi, searching for any signs of weakness, any small opening that he could exploit. But Musashi gave nothing away. His body was relaxed, his expression unreadable, as if he was simply standing in a field of grass rather than on the cusp of a deadly battle. Then, without warning, Kojiro moved. His nodachi, impossibly long and deceptively light in his skilled hands, sliced through the air with a sound like the wind itself parting. It was the kind of strike that few swordsmen could have seen, let alone parried. The blade was aimed directly at Musashi's head, the force behind it enough to cleave a man in two. But Musashi was not where the blade fell. With a movement so fluid it seemed almost lazy, Musashi stepped aside, letting the nodachi pass by him with mere inches to spare. The wooden sword in his hand rose in a single, smooth arc, deflecting the strike with a crack that echoed across the shore. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like a simple dodge, but to the samurai who watched, it was a display of masterful precision. Kojiro pressed the attack, his nodachi sweeping through the air in a series of rapid, deadly arcs. Each strike was faster than the last, each one aimed at a different point. Musashi's throat, his chest, his legs. The blade moved like lightning, and yet Musashi evaded each strike with the same calm grace, his wooden sword meeting Kojiro's steel with a series of sharp, ringing clashes. For what felt like an eternity, the two men danced across the shore. Their movements so swift and fluid that they seemed almost choreographed. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their breaths held as they witnessed the clash of two masters. Kojiro's skill with the nodachi was undeniable. His strikes were powerful, precise, and unrelenting. But Musashi, with his unorthodox style and seemingly effortless movement, matched him at every turn. The duel was not just a contest of strength or speed, it was a battle of wills. Musashi was not merely defending himself, he was drawing Kojiro into his rhythm, forcing him to play by his rules. Every time Kojiro thought he had an opening, Musashi would slip away, deflecting the attack with a movement so subtle that it was almost imperceptible. The wooden sword, crude as it appeared, moved with the same precision and control as any finely crafted blade. Kojiro's frustration began to mount. He had never faced an opponent like Musashi, someone who could meet his skill with such ease, someone who seemed to read his every move before he made it. His strikes grew more aggressive, his attacks more forceful, but Musashi remained calm, his movements smooth and deliberate. Then, in a flash, Musashi struck. It was a movement so fast, so unexpected, that for a moment the crowd did not realize what had happened. One moment Kojiro was pressing the attack, his nodachi raised for another strike, and the next Musashi's wooden sword came crashing down on his head with a resounding crack. Kojiro staggered, his nodachi slipping from his grasp. Blood trickled from a wound on his forehead, and for the first time his calm demeanor faltered. He blinked in confusion as if trying to process what had just occurred. The world seemed to slow, the sounds of the sea and the murmurs of the crowd fading into the background as Kojiro's vision blurred. Musashi stood over him, his expression unchanged, his wooden sword still held lightly in his hand. The duel was over. Chapter 4. The Moment of Victory. The stillness that followed was deafening. The sea, the wind, the distant calls of seabirds, everything seemed to fall into a deep, reverent silence as Kojiro sank to his knees. His once proud and unyielding posture crumbled beneath the weight of his defeat. The blood trickling from the wound on his forehead dripped onto the rocks below, staining the ground where he knelt. Musashi remained where he was, his eyes fixed on Kojiro, his breath steady and controlled. His victory had not come from strength or speed, but from a deeper understanding of combat, of timing, strategy, and the power of the mind. Kojiro's skill with the sword was unmatched, but Musashi had seen through his technique, understanding not just the physical movements of the blade, but the intentions behind them. For Kojiro, the realization of his defeat came slowly, painfully. He had been so certain of his victory, so confident in the power of his nodachi and the precision of his technique. But now, as he knelt before Musashi, he understood that he had been bested not by a better swordsman, but by a man who had mastered the very essence of combat. Musashi offered no words of consolation, no gesture of triumph. He simply bowed his head slightly, a sign of respect for the opponent who had fought bravely and skillfully. Then, with the same calm grace that had characterized his every movement, he turned and walked away, leaving Kojiro kneeling in the sand, the sound of the waves crashing softly in the distance. The crowd, still stunned by the sudden and decisive end to the duel, slowly began to stir. Whispers spread among them, filled with awe and disbelief. Miyamoto Musashi had won. The greatest swordsman in Japan had been defeated by a man with nothing more than a wooden sword. Kojiro, left alone on the beach, slowly rose to his feet. His eyes were filled with a mixture of anger, shame, and admiration. He had been defeated, yes, but in that defeat, he had glimpsed something greater, an understanding of the sword that transcended mere technique. It was a bitter lesson, but one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As the sun began to set over the island of Ganryū-jima, casting long shadows across the shore, the duel became a memory, a story that would be told and retold for generations to come. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed the clash of two legends, the image of Musashi standing victorious, his wooden sword in hand, would remain etched in their minds forever. Chapter 5. The Legacy of Ganryū-jima. The story of the duel at Ganryū-jima did not end with the fall of Kojiro. In the days, weeks, and years that followed, the tale spread across Japan, growing in legend with each retelling. Samurai, peasants, and noble lords alike spoke of the duel, of the two great warriors who had faced each other on a lonely island, and of the unexpected outcome that had shocked the nation. Miyamoto Musashi's victory was not simply a matter of defeating an opponent. It was a statement, a challenge to the very foundations of the samurai tradition. In defeating Kojiro with a wooden sword, Musashi had demonstrated that true mastery of the sword was not about the weapon itself, but about the mind and spirit of the warrior who wielded it. For Musashi, the duel was yet another step on his lifelong journey of self-mastery. He would go on to fight many more battles, refining his skills and deepening his understanding of the way of the sword. But the duel at Ganryū-jima remained one of his most famous victories, a moment in which his philosophy of combat was laid bare for all to see. Kojiro, despite his defeat, remained a figure of immense respect. His skill with the nodachi was still considered unparalleled, and many continued to view him as one of the greatest swordsmen of his time. In the years that followed, stories of Kojiro's Tsubame Gaeshi and his battles with other swordsmen would be told alongside the story of his duel with Musashi, a reminder that even the greatest warriors could fall. The island of Ganryū-jima itself became a place of pilgrimage for swordsmen and scholars alike. Those who sought to understand the way of the sword would travel to the island, walking the same ground where Musashi and Kojiro had faced each other. The beach where the duel had taken place became a sacred site, a place where the whispers of history could still be heard in the rustle of the wind and the crash of the waves. For generations, the duel at Ganryū-jima would be remembered not just as a contest between two men, but as a moment that defined the very essence of the samurai spirit. It was a reminder that the sword was not just a weapon, but a tool for understanding oneself and the world. Chapter 6: The Whisper of the Wind. As the years passed and the story of the duel at Ganryū-jima became part of the fabric of Japan's history, the island remained a quiet, solitary place, its shores touched only by the wind and the sea. Yet, for those who visited, there was always a sense that something lingered there, a presence, a memory, a whisper carried on the wind. It was said that if you stood on the beach at sunset, with the waves lapping gently at your feet and the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, you could still hear the echoes of that fateful day. The sound of swords clashing, the cries of warriors, the deep silence that followed Musashi's final strike. All of it seemed to hang in the air, a reminder of the power of a single moment. For Musashi, the duel at Ganryū-jima had been a pivotal chapter in his life, but it was not the end of his journey. He would go on to write the Book of 5 Rings, a treatise on strategy and the art of combat that would influence generations of warriors and thinkers. His philosophy, which emphasized the importance of adaptability, mental clarity, and the fluidity of life, would resonate far beyond the battlefield. Kojiro, though he had been defeated, became a symbol of perseverance and honor. His name, like Musashi's, was immortalized in the stories and legends of Japan. And though his final battle had ended in defeat, his legacy as a master swordsman lived on, inspiring countless samurai to pursue the way of the sword with the same dedication and passion that he had shown. And so, dear listener, as you drift further into the world of ancient Japan, let the whispers of history guide you into the next tale, where the spirit of the samurai lives on, and the stories of honor, skill, and destiny continue to unfold. The Tale of Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Chapter 1: The Exiled Child. In the fading twilight of the Heian period, when the once great imperial court of Kyoto was losing its grip on the reins of power, a child was born whose destiny would forever alter the course of Japan's history. The child was Minamoto no Yoshitsune, born into a time of chaos, war, and betrayal. Though he would grow to become one of the most revered and tragic figures in Japanese lore, his beginnings were marked by violence and loss. Yoshitsune was born into the powerful Minamoto clan, a warrior family with a long and storied lineage. His father, Minamoto no Yoshitomo, was a proud and ambitious man who sought to claim power for the Minamoto by overthrowing their rivals, the Taira clan. The Taira, under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, had risen to prominence during the waning years of the imperial court, gaining control over the government and placing their own family members in key positions of power. In 1159, Yoshitomo launched the Hōichi Rebellion, a bold attempt to wrest power from the Taira and restore the Minamoto to their former glory. But the rebellion ended in disaster. The Taira forces crushed the Minamoto, and Yoshitomo was betrayed and killed by his own allies. The aftermath was brutal. Taira no Kiyomori ordered the execution of Yoshitomo's sons, purging the Minamoto family of its potential heirs. Yoshitsune, a mere infant at the time, was spared from the massacre. Kiyomori, perhaps believing that a child posed no threat to his rule, allowed Yoshitsune to live, though he was sent far from the centers of power to the Kurama-dera temple in the mountains north of Kyoto. There, in the serene isolation of the temple, Yoshitsune was to be raised as a monk, far from the bloodshed and intrigue of the world he had been born into. But even in the peaceful sanctuary of Kurama-dera, the weight of Yoshitsune's destiny was heavy upon him. As a child, he had no knowledge of his father's rebellion or his family's bloody past, but the fire of the Minamoto blood still ran through his veins. The temple monks, gentle and wise, taught him the ways of peace, meditation, and the quiet life of a monk. Yet, from a young age, Yoshitsune found himself restless, his heart yearning for something more than the silent halls of the temple and the teachings of the sutras. At night, while the other young novices slept, Yoshitsune would slip away into the surrounding mountains, practicing with a wooden sword he had carved from a tree branch. He moved with a natural grace and agility, his every swing driven by an unspoken urge, as though the warrior spirit of his ancestors had awakened within him. The monks, aware of his secret training, tried to dissuade him, reminding him that his life was meant to be one of spiritual contemplation, not violence. But Yoshitsune could not be swayed. His fate, though still hidden from him, was not one of peace. It was during these nightly excursions into the forest that Yoshitsune encountered the mysterious Tengu, supernatural beings of legend, who were said to live in the mountains. Half human and half bird, the Tengu were known as master swordsmen, and they took a particular interest in Yoshitsune. Whether they saw in him the potential for greatness or simply a kindred spirit, the Tengu decided to train him in the ways of the sword. Under the tutelage of the Tengu, Yoshitsune's skills grew rapidly. They taught him not only the physical techniques of combat, but also the deeper, more philosophical aspects of martial arts, the importance of balance, of patience, and of seeing the world with clarity, even in the heat of battle. The Tengu's training was harsh, but Yoshitsune thrived, his body growing stronger and his mind sharper with each passing day. By the time he reached his teenage years, Yoshitsune had become an accomplished swordsman, though few knew of his abilities. He had lived in relative isolation, far from the political intrigues and warfare that still ravaged Japan. But all of that was about to change. Word eventually reached Kurama-dera that Yoshitsune's half-brother, Minamoto no Yoritomo, had risen in rebellion against the Taira. Yoritomo, who had survived the purge of the Minamoto by going into exile, had spent years biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Now, with the support of the Eastern samurai, Yoritomo was gathering forces to overthrow the Taira and restore the Minamoto clan to power. For Yoshitsune, this was the call he had been waiting for. His brother's rebellion was not just a political movement. It was a chance to reclaim the honor of their family, to avenge their father's death and to restore the Minamoto to their rightful place in the world. Leaving the temple behind, Yoshitsune made his way to Kamakura, where he swore fealty to Yoritomo and pledged to fight for the Minamoto cause. Thus began the journey of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the exiled child who would become one of Japan's greatest warriors. Chapter 2: The Rise of a Hero. With his sword at his side and the fire of his ancestors in his heart, Yoshitsune joined the ranks of his brother's rebellion, stepping into a world of blood, steel, and honor. The Genpei War, the great conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans, had begun, and the future of Japan would be decided on the battlefield. Yoshitsune quickly rose through the ranks of the Minamoto army. His natural leadership and unparalleled skill with the sword setting him apart from other warriors. Though young and untested in real combat, Yoshitsune's tactical genius became evident in the early stages of the war. He possessed a keen understanding of strategy, able to outthink his opponents and turn the tide of battle with bold, unexpected maneuvers. One of Yoshitsune's earliest victories came at the Battle of Ichi-no-Tani, a turning point in the war. The Taira had fortified themselves in a near impenetrable position along the coast, their forces protected by the steep cliffs of Ichi-no-Tani on one side and the sea on the other. The Taira commanders believed their position was unassailable, and for a time it seemed that they were right. The Minamoto forces struggled to breach the Taira defenses, and morale among the troops began to wane. But Yoshitsune saw an opportunity where others saw only defeat. He devised a plan to scale the steep cliffs above Ichi-no-Tani, a feat that seemed impossible to most. The cliffs were treacherous, the terrain jagged and unforgiving, and to attempt such a climb with armor and weapons was a gamble few would have dared take. But Yoshitsune, ever bold, led a small contingent of warriors up the cliffs under the cover of night. It was a grueling ascent. The men, struggling against the sharp rocks and the cold night air, followed Yoshitsune without hesitation, trusting in his vision. By the time they reached the top, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. From their vantage point, they could see the Taira forces below, still unaware of the danger looming above them. With a fierce battle cry, Yoshitsune and his men descended upon the Taira, catching them completely off guard. The surprise attack sent the Taira forces into disarray, and within hours, the Minamoto had secured a decisive victory. The Battle of Ichi-no-Tani was a testament to Yoshitsune's brilliance as a commander and his willingness to take risks that others would not. His name began to spread like wildfire through the land, and he became known as a hero of the Minamoto cause. But the war was far from over. The Taira, though weakened, still held power in the west, and the final confrontation between the two clans loomed on the horizon. Chapter 3: The Battle of Dan-no-Ura. The Battle of Dan-no-Ura, fought in the spring of 1185, was to be the final and most decisive clash of the Genpei War. The Taira, realizing that their power was slipping away, had gathered their remaining forces for one last stand. Among them was the young Emperor Antoku, the child emperor whom the Taira had installed on the throne in a bid to legitimize their rule. The battle took place in the waters of the Shimonoseki Strait, a narrow body of water known for its treacherous currents and unpredictable tides. The Taira, skilled in naval warfare, believed that they could use the shifting tides to their advantage, luring the Minamoto fleet into dangerous waters where they could be overwhelmed. But Yoshitsune, ever the strategist, had anticipated the Taira's plan. He knew that the battle would not be won by brute force alone. It would require careful timing, precision, and a deep understanding of the sea. As the two fleets clashed in the strait, the Minamoto forces appeared to be at a disadvantage, their ships struggling against the strong currents, while the Taira held their position. For hours, the battle raged with no clear victor. Arrows flew through the air, swords clashed, and the sea turned red with the blood of fallen warriors. But Yoshitsune, commanding from the front lines, remained calm. He knew that the tide would soon turn, literally. As the tide shifted, the Taira fleet found themselves caught in the strong current. Their ships pulled away from their defensive position. Seizing the opportunity, Yoshitsune ordered his forces to press the attack. The Minamoto fleet surged forward, overwhelming the disoriented Taira forces. In the chaos that followed, the Taira were utterly defeated. Their ships were sunk, their warriors slain, and their hopes of victory dashed. In a final desperate act, the remaining Taira loyalists, realizing that all was lost, took the young Emperor Antoku and leaped into the sea, choosing death over capture. The boy emperor, barely 7 years old, was carried away by the waves, and with him, the power of the Taira clan sank beneath the waters of Dan no Ura. The Genpei War was over. The Minamoto had emerged victorious, and Yoshitsune was hailed as a hero, the man who had brought down the mighty Taira and restored his family's honor. His name became synonymous with bravery, cunning, and the indomitable spirit of the samurai. But even as Yoshitsune stood at the height of his glory, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. The end of the war had brought peace to Japan, but it had also sown the seeds of betrayal. Chapter 4. The Fall from Grace. Despite his victories on the battlefield, Yoshitsune's life was not destined for peace. His half-brother Yoritomo, who had led the Minamoto from the shadows, grew increasingly suspicious of Yoshitsune's growing fame and popularity. Though Yoshitsune had fought and won battles in Yoritomo's name, Yoritomo feared that his younger brother's charisma and military prowess would one day eclipse his own authority. Yoritomo, a man of cold ambition and political acumen, had always been cautious about maintaining control over the Minamoto forces. While Yoshitsune had led the armies to victory, Yoritomo had remained behind the scenes, consolidating power and ensuring that his position as the leader of the clan remained unchallenged. But Yoshitsune's growing influence among the samurai and the people of Japan made Yoritomo uneasy. He began to view his brother not as a loyal ally, but as a potential rival. The thought of Yoshitsune rising in power, perhaps even being seen as the true leader of the Minamoto, was intolerable to Yoritomo. And so, despite everything Yoshitsune had done for the Minamoto cause, Yoritomo began to plot his brother's downfall. Through a series of political machinations, Yoritomo turned the imperial court against Yoshitsune, branding him a traitor and an enemy of the state. Yoshitsune, who had fought and bled for the Minamoto, now found himself hunted by the very family he had sought to restore. Forced to flee for his life, Yoshitsune became a fugitive, moving from one hiding place to another as Yoritomo's forces pursued him across the land. His once glorious reputation was now stained with accusations of treachery, and those who had once praised him now turned their backs on him, fearing Yoritomo's wrath. Yoshitsune's final refuge came in the northern province of Hiraizumi. where the powerful Fujiwara clan still held sway. The Fujiwara, who had long been allies of the Minamoto, welcomed Yoshitsune and offered him sanctuary. But even in the remote north, Yoshitsune could not escape Yoritomo's reach. The Fujiwara, under pressure from Yoritomo, eventually turned against Yoshitsune, leaving him with nowhere to run. Chapter 5. The Final Stand. Yoshitsune's final stand came in 1189 at the fortress of Koromogawa in Hiraizumi. Trapped and outnumbered, Yoshitsune knew that his life was nearing its end. The walls of the fortress, which had once seemed impenetrable, now felt like a prison closing in around him. On the night before the final assault, Yoshitsune sat alone in the inner chamber of the fortress, his thoughts heavy with the weight of his fate. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain passes, carrying with it the whispers of the Tengu who had trained him in his youth. His mind drifted back to those early days in the mountains when he had first learned the way of the sword, and to the battles he had fought since then. The victories, the losses, the honor, and the betrayal. But there was no time for regret. Yoshitsune had always known that his life would end by the sword. He had lived as a warrior, and he would die as one. When Yoritomo's forces stormed the fortress the next day, Yoshitsune fought with the ferocity of a cornered tiger. Though vastly outnumbered, he cut down dozens of his enemies, his sword moving with the precision and grace of a man who had mastered the art of combat. But even Yoshitsune could not hold off the inevitable. As the enemy closed in, Yoshitsune retreated to the inner sanctum, where he performed the ritual of seppuku, taking his own life rather than allowing himself to be captured and humiliated. His final act was one of defiance, a refusal to bow to the forces that had betrayed him. Chapter 6. The Whisper of the Wind. With Yoshitsune's death, the Minamoto's greatest hero was lost to the world. But his spirit, like the wind that swept through the mountains, could not be extinguished. His life, filled with triumph and tragedy, became the stuff of legend, and for generations his name would be spoken with reverence. The tale of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the exiled child who became a hero, is one of loyalty, betrayal, and the pursuit of honor. Though his life ended in tragedy, Yoshitsune's legacy endured. He became a symbol of the samurai spirit, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the warrior's heart remains unbroken. As the winds of history continue to whisper their ancient tales, let the story of Yoshitsune guide you into peaceful sleep, knowing that honor, like the mountains and rivers of Japan, endures forever. The Legend of the Swordsmith Muramasa. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Master. In the waning light of the Muromachi period, when the fires of war burned brightly across Japan and the land was divided by the ambitions of rival warlords, there lived a swordsmith whose name would become synonymous with both unparalleled craftsmanship and a dark, malevolent power. His name was Muramasa, and he would become one of the most infamous swordsmiths in Japanese history. The story of Muramasa begins not on the battlefield, but in the quiet village of Kuwana, in the province of Ise. It was a village nestled between mountains and rivers, a place where nature's beauty flourished, even as the rest of the country was ravaged by conflict. The people of Kuwana were simple folk, farmers, fishermen, and artisans who lived their lives in the rhythm of the seasons, far removed from the political intrigues of the samurai clans that vied for dominance in Kyoto. Muramasa was born into a family of swordsmiths, men who had for generations crafted blades for local samurai and warriors. His father, a skilled smith in his own right, had passed down the ancient knowledge of forging steel, teaching Muramasa the secrets of tempering metal, of shaping the blade, and of giving it the perfect edge. From a young age, Muramasa showed a natural talent for the craft. His hands, though small and calloused, moved with precision and care, shaping the raw steel into beautiful, deadly works of art. But there was something different about Muramasa, something that set him apart from his forebears. His passion for sword-making went beyond mere skill. There was a fire in him, a fierce determination to push the boundaries of what was possible, to create swords that were not just weapons, but living extensions of the samurai who wielded them. As he grew, Muramasa became obsessed with the idea of creating the perfect sword. He spent days and nights in his forge, hammering away at red-hot steel, each strike of his hammer filled with an intensity that bordered on madness. He would often forgo sleep and food, consumed by the desire to perfect his craft. His father, though proud of his son's talent, grew concerned. He had seen other swordsmiths become consumed by their work, losing themselves in the pursuit of perfection. But Muramasa was not to be dissuaded. By the time he reached adulthood, Muramasa's reputation as a master swordsmith had begun to spread beyond the borders of Ise. Samurai from neighboring provinces came to his forge, seeking blades that could give them an edge in battle. Muramasa's swords were said to be unmatched in sharpness and durability, capable of cutting through armor and bone with ease. But there was something else, something darker, that began to attach itself to Muramasa's name, a rumor whispered among samurai and villagers alike, that his swords were cursed. Chapter 2. The Curse of Muramasa. The legend of the curse began innocently enough. A samurai named Ichiro, who had commissioned a sword from Muramasa, was said to have slain his enemies with such ferocity that those who witnessed the battle claimed the sword itself had a thirst for blood. Ichiro, once a calm and disciplined warrior, became increasingly violent and unpredictable after wielding the blade, often flying into uncontrollable rages. His fellow samurai began to whisper that the sword had driven him mad, that it was cursed by the spirit of Muramasa's forge. At first, these rumors were dismissed as mere superstition, the product of overactive imaginations in a time of war. But as more and more warriors who wielded Muramasa's swords met with tragic and violent ends, the whispers grew louder. Some claimed that the swords had a will of their own, that they craved blood and demanded to be used. Others said that the swords were imbued with the spirit of Muramasa himself, that his relentless drive for perfection had somehow tainted the blades, giving them a dark and malevolent power. Muramasa, for his part, paid little attention to these rumors. He cared only for his work, for the perfection of his craft. He believed that a sword was only as good as the hand that wielded it, and if a warrior fell to madness or misfortune after using one of his blades, it was not the sword's fault, but the warrior's weakness. To Muramasa, his swords were flawless, and any failure belonged to the man, not the blade. But the stories persisted. Samurai who carried Muramasa's swords into battle often returned changed. Some were more violent, their tempers quick to flare, while others met with untimely deaths, cut down by their own men or struck down by strange accidents. One warrior, it was said, had been found dead in his sleep, his Muramasa sword still clutched in his hand, the blade stained with his own blood, though no wound could be found on his body. As the years passed, the legend of the curse grew, and the name Muramasa became both revered and feared. Some samurai sought out his swords, believing that the power within them would make them invincible on the battlefield. Others refused to even touch a Muramasa blade, fearing that the curse would bring about their own downfall. Despite the growing fear surrounding his swords, Muramasa's reputation only continued to rise. His forge became a place of pilgrimage for those who sought the perfect weapon, and many samurai, desperate for victory in a time of endless war, were willing to risk the curse if it meant gaining an advantage in battle. But even as Muramasa's fame spread, so too did the darkness that seemed to cling to his creations. The swordsmith, once known for his passion and dedication, began to change. He became more reclusive, more consumed by his work. His temper, always fiery, grew shorter, and those who worked in his forge began to speak of strange happenings. Fires that burned too hot, metal that screamed as it was hammered into shape, and an eerie presence that seemed to linger in the shadows of the forge. Muramasa, they whispered, had become possessed by the same dark power that had cursed his swords. Chapter 3. The Madness of Muramasa. As the years wore on, Muramasa's descent into madness became more apparent. He no longer sought perfection for its own sake. Now, it seemed, he was driven by something darker, something that gnawed at his mind and twisted his soul. His once legendary focus had turned into an obsession, and his temper, once fiery but controlled, had become a raging inferno that could be ignited by the slightest provocation. It was said that Muramasa had begun to hear voices in the forge, voices that whispered to him as he worked, urging him to create ever more powerful and dangerous blades. He would speak to these voices as though they were real, cursing them when his work did not meet their impossible standards, and laughing maniacally when a blade was finally completed. His apprentices, who had once admired his skill and dedication, began to fear him. They would often find Muramasa standing in the forge late at night, his eyes wild, his hands trembling as he hammered away at a piece of steel. The air in the forge seemed to crackle with a malevolent energy, and the heat of the fires was almost unbearable, as though the forge itself had become a portal to some otherworldly realm. Muramasa's madness soon began to manifest in his work. The swords he forged during this time were unlike any he had made before. Beautiful, yes, but also terrifying. The blades seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and those who wielded them reported feeling a strange sense of power, as though the swords had a life of their own. But this power came at a price. The swords were unpredictable, their edges sharp enough to cut through anything, but they also seemed to crave blood, turning on their wielders if they were not fed. It was during this time that the curse of Muramasa became fully entrenched in the minds of the samurai. Warriors who carried Muramasa blades into battle began to experience strange and horrifying phenomena. Some reported feeling an overwhelming urge to kill not just their enemies, but their comrades as well. Others claimed that the swords would vibrate in their hands, guiding their strikes toward fatal blows even when they had intended to spare their opponents. The madness that had consumed Muramasa was now seeping into his creations, and the once great swordsmith had become a legend not just for his skill, but for the dark power that seemed to flow through his blades. Chapter 4. The Shogun's Fear. As the legend of the cursed sword spread, it reached the ears of one of the most powerful men in Japan, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the shogun who had unified the country after decades of civil war. Ieyasu was a cautious and pragmatic ruler, a man who had risen to power through careful planning and a deep understanding of human nature. He had little patience for superstition, but even he could not ignore the growing stories of Muramasa's cursed blades. The Tokugawa clan had a long and complicated history with Muramasa. It was said that many of Ieyasu's ancestors had wielded Muramasa swords, and some even claimed that the Tokugawa owed their rise to power, in part, to the strength of these blades. But as Ieyasu consolidated his rule, he began to distance himself from the swordsmith's creations. There were whispers in the shogun's court that Muramasa's swords were cursed not just in a general sense, but specifically against the Tokugawa clan. Ieyasu's grandfather had been killed by a retainer wielding a Muramasa sword, and his father had suffered a fatal wound from one of the swordsmith's blades as well. Even Ieyasu himself had narrowly escaped death on several occasions when his enemies had used Muramasa swords in assassination attempts. Whether these incidents were mere coincidence or the result of a genuine curse, Ieyasu could not say. But as the stories of Muramasa's madness and the malevolent power of his swords continued to grow, the shogun decided to take action. He issued an edict banning the use of Muramasa swords within the Tokugawa domain. Any samurai found carrying one of the cursed blades was ordered to surrender it or face severe punishment. The edict also extended to the forges that still produced Muramasa swords. Those who continued to craft or sell the cursed weapons were subject to execution. But despite the shogun's efforts, Muramasa's swords continued to find their way into the hands of warriors. Some samurai, believing in the sword's power, refused to part with them, even at the risk of their own lives. Others, drawn to the legend of the cursed blades, sought them out as symbols of rebellion against the Tokugawa regime. The more Ieyasu tried to suppress the legend, the more it seemed to grow, until the name Muramasa became synonymous not just with cursed swords, but with defiance and power. Chapter 5. The Final Blade. As Muramasa's madness deepened, so too did his desire to create one final masterpiece, a sword that would surpass all others, a blade so perfect that it would be remembered for all time. He locked himself away in his forge, working day and night, driven by the voices that now dominated his every thought. His apprentices, fearful for their lives, fled the forge, leaving Muramasa alone with the heat of the fires and the twisted thoughts that filled his mind. For days the sounds of hammering and the crackle of the forge echoed through the village, and at night the sky above Kuwana glowed red with the light of the flames. No one knew exactly what transpired in the final days of Muramasa's life, but the story that emerged was one of horror and tragedy. It was said that as Muramasa worked on his final blade, he poured not just his skill, but his very soul into the steel. He hammered away at the metal with a frenzy that bordered on madness, shaping the sword into a thing of terrible beauty. The blade, when it was finished, was flawless, its edge so sharp that it could cut through stone, its surface so smooth that it reflected the light like a mirror. But as Muramasa held the sword in his hands, he realized that something was missing. The blade was perfect, yes, but it lacked life, the spark that would make it truly legendary. And so, in a final act of madness, Muramasa took the sword and turned it on himself. With a single stroke, he plunged the blade into his own chest, his blood flowing over the steel and staining it red. As his life ebbed away, Muramasa whispered a final incantation, binding his soul to the blade. The sword, now infused with the spirit of its creator, pulsed with a dark energy, its surface glowing faintly in the dim light of the forge. When Muramasa's body was found the next morning, the sword lay beside him, its edge gleaming with a malevolent light. The villagers, terrified of the cursed blade, refused to touch it, and for years it remained in the abandoned forge, a relic of a man who had given his life to his craft and paid the ultimate price. Chapter 6: The Whisper of the Sword. In the years that followed, the legend of Muramasa and his cursed swords continued to grow. Samurai, desperate for power, sought out his blades, believing that they held the key to victory in battle. But those who wielded the cursed swords often met with strange and violent ends, their lives cut short by the very weapons they had hoped would make them invincible. The final sword, the one Muramasa had crafted with his dying breath, became the stuff of legend. It was said that the blade had a will of its own, that it whispered to those who carried it, urging them to kill. Some claimed that the sword was possessed by the spirit of Muramasa himself, that his madness lived on in the steel, and that those who wielded the blade would be consumed by the same dark forces that had driven him to his death. For centuries, the sword was lost to history, its whereabouts unknown. But the legend of Muramasa's cursed blades remained, a haunting reminder of the thin line between genius and madness, between creation and destruction. And so, dear listener, as you drift further into the world of ancient Japan, let the whispers of history guide you into the next tale, where the spirit of the swordsmith lives on, and the legend of Muramasa's cursed blades continues to echo through the ages. The Ghostly Warriors of Hōichi the Earless. Chapter 1: The Tale of the Hōichi. In the ancient city of Akama, where the winds carry the scent of salt from the nearby sea, and the shadows of history linger in the narrow streets, there lies a cemetery unlike any other. It is the final resting place of the mighty Hōichi clan, who once ruled Japan with power and grace, but whose empire fell in a single catastrophic moment. Their spirits, it is said, still roam the earth, bound by the weight of their tragic past. The Hōichi, also known as the Taira, had been one of the most powerful clans in Japan during the late Heian period. Their dominance was unchallenged for years, and their influence stretched from the capital to the far reaches of the provinces. But their reign came to a violent end in the Genpei War, when the Minamoto clan rose against them in a brutal civil conflict that tore the nation apart. The final battle, fought at sea in the treacherous waters of the Dan-no-ura, marked the end of the Hōichi's rule. The Taira forces, outmaneuvered by the Minamoto fleet, were utterly destroyed. The child Emperor Antoku, barely 7 years old, was carried by his grandmother into the waves, choosing to drown rather than face capture by their enemies. With his death, the imperial seal and the Hōichi's claim to power were lost beneath the sea, never to be recovered. Yet the Hōichi's defeat did not bring them peace. The spirits of the fallen warriors, it was said, wandered restlessly, unable to cross into the next world. In the centuries that followed, the people of Akama built shrines to honor these lost souls, praying for their salvation and hoping to appease their vengeful spirits. For it was widely believed that the dead, if not properly mourned, could bring great misfortune upon the living. Among the many legends that grew out of this tragic history None was more chilling or more poignant than the story of Hōichi the Earless, a blind musician whose fate became entwined with the ghostly warriors of the Hōichi in ways no one could have imagined. Chapter 2. Hōichi, the blind biwa player. Hōichi was a humble biwa player, a man of modest means who lived in the outskirts of Akama, near the great temple where the souls of the Hōichi were honored. He had been blind since birth, and his world was one of darkness, illuminated only by the sound of his music. Yet despite his blindness, Hōichi possessed a talent so extraordinary that it drew people from all walks of life to hear him play. The biwa, a lute-like instrument, was Hōichi's constant companion. Its gentle, resonant notes could evoke both the deepest sorrows and the most profound joys. But it was Hōichi's voice, clear and haunting, that made him truly remarkable. When he sang the Hōichi Monogatari, the epic tale of the rise and fall of the Hōichi clan, his voice seemed to carry the weight of the past itself, drawing listeners into the ancient battles and the heart-wrenching tragedies of long-dead emperors and warriors. Hōichi had learned the Hōichi Monogatari as a young apprentice, and over the years he had perfected his performance. Each time he played, it was as if the story were coming alive again, the clash of swords and the cries of the fallen echoing through the air. His renditions were so vivid, so powerful, that even those who had heard the tale many times before found themselves moved to tears. Though Hōichi was revered for his skill, his life was one of solitude. He lived in a small, weather-beaten house near the temple, alone except for the company of his biwa. The people of Akama respected him, but few truly knew him. His blindness had isolated him from the world in ways that went beyond mere physical sight. Yet Hōichi did not complain. His music was his life, and through it, he felt connected to the world, even if he could not see it. But there were nights when the wind whispered strange things, when the temple bells tolled softly in the distance, and Hōichi felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. On those nights, as he sat alone in his house, playing his biwa to the empty air, he wondered if perhaps the spirits of the Hōichi were listening. He wondered if they too were moved by his music, if they wept for the tragedies he sang, or if they were still filled with the rage and sorrow of their untimely deaths. Little did Hōichi know that his music had indeed reached the ears of the dead, and that they were soon to come for him. Chapter 3. The First Encounter. It was on a particularly still and humid summer night that the first strange event occurred. The moon hung low in the sky, veiled by a thin mist that gave it an eerie, otherworldly glow. The streets of Akama were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant bark of a dog. Hōichi, as was his custom, had finished playing his biwa for the evening and was preparing to retire when he heard a sound outside his door, a soft, deliberate knock. Surprised, for he had not been expecting any visitors at this late hour, Hōichi rose from his mat and made his way to the door, his cane tapping softly against the floor. When he opened it, he was greeted by the sound of heavy footsteps and the unmistakable scent of sea salt carried on the breeze. Though he could not see, Hōichi sensed that the person standing before him was a samurai. There was an air of authority and danger about him. "Are you the musician called Hōichi?" the man asked in a deep, resonant voice. "Yes," Hōichi replied, his voice steady though his heart had begun to race. "I am he." "My master has heard of your great skill," the man continued. "He commands you to come and perform for him this night." Hōichi hesitated. It was unusual to receive such a request at this hour, and there was something unsettling about the man's presence. Yet the samurai's tone brooked no refusal, and Hōichi knew better than to disobey a warrior's command. "Very well," Hōichi said, bowing slightly. "I will come." The samurai gave a short, satisfied grunt and led Hōichi out into the night. The air was thick with the scent of the sea, and Hōichi could hear the distant crash of waves against the shore as they walked. His cane tapped rhythmically against the stone paths, guiding him forward, but his mind was filled with unease. There was something strange about the way the samurai walked. His steps were heavy, yet they made no sound on the cobblestones. And though they seemed to be moving away from the village, Hōichi could not shake the feeling that they were somehow still near the temple, near the cemetery where the Haika were buried. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at their destination. Hōichi could sense the vast space around him, the air cooler and more open than before. It felt as though they had entered a courtyard, perhaps part of a grand estate. The samurai led him forward, his hand firm on Hōichi's shoulder. "We have arrived," the samurai said. "Prepare yourself to perform for my master." Hōichi nodded and carefully lowered himself to the ground, adjusting the biwa in his lap. As he strummed the first few notes, the air around him seemed to change. The night grew stiller, the sounds of the sea and the wind fading into silence. And then, from the depths of the darkness, Hōichi heard a sound that chilled him to the bone, the clank of armor, the shuffle of feet, and the unmistakable presence of a gathering army. Chapter 4. A Performance for the Dead. As Hōichi began to play, the air seemed to hum with anticipation. His fingers danced across the strings of the biwa, producing the delicate mournful notes of the Haika monogatari. He sang of the rise and fall of the Haika clan, of their victories and their eventual defeat at Dan-no-ura, where the sea claimed the lives of so many warriors, and the young emperor Antoku. His voice, clear and haunting, filled the night, carrying with it the weight of centuries of sorrow. But as he played, Hōichi became aware of something strange. The atmosphere around him had shifted. What had at first seemed like a quiet, empty courtyard now felt as though it were filled with a great multitude of people, silent, watchful, and expectant. Though he could not see them, he felt their presence keenly. There was a coldness in the air, a chill that seeped into his bones despite the warm summer night. And then, from the darkness, he heard a voice, a deep, commanding voice that sent a shiver down his spine. "Your music is truly extraordinary," the voice said. "It is as though you have brought our very story to life. Continue, Hōichi, and do not stop until you have sung every last verse." The voice was close, far too close. Hōichi felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, but he forced himself to remain calm. He nodded in the direction of the voice and continued to play, pouring all of his skill and emotion into the performance. For hours, Hōichi played, his fingers moving with a speed and precision that astonished even himself. He sang of the Haike's glory, their hubris, and their tragic fall. He could feel the presence of the audience, an audience that was far larger than any living gathering he had ever performed for. The sound of armor shifting, of swords clinking against belts, filled the air around him. But no one spoke. They listened, silent and enraptured, as if they had been waiting for centuries to hear their story told. It was only when the final notes of the Haika monogatari faded into the night that Hōichi realized how exhausted he was. His fingers were raw, his throat dry and aching, but he dared not stop without permission. The deep voice spoke again, this time with a note of satisfaction. "You have done well, Hōichi. You have honored us with your performance. You will return tomorrow night to continue." Hōichi, though filled with dread, bowed his head in acknowledgement. The presence of the samurai who had led him there returned, and Hōichi felt the firm grip on his shoulder once more. He was led back through the winding streets of Akama, his mind whirling with confusion and fear. He could not shake the feeling that he had just performed for an audience of ghosts, for the restless spirits of the hiker who still wandered the earth, unable to find peace. By the time Hōichi was returned to his house, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. He collapsed onto his mat, exhausted but too troubled to sleep. His mind replayed the events of the night, and though he could not see the faces of his audience, he could not shake the certainty that they had been the spirits of the fallen warriors. The following night, the samurai returned, and once again, Hōichi was led to the mysterious courtyard, and once again, he played for the ghostly audience, his music filling the night with the tragic tale of the hiker. For several nights, this strange ritual continued. Each time, Hōichi was brought before the ghostly warriors, and each time he played with all the skill and emotion he could muster. The spirits, for their part, seemed satisfied, and though Hōichi feared them, he could not refuse their command. Chapter 5. The Priest's Warning. Hōichi's nocturnal performances did not go unnoticed. The priests of the temple where Hōichi often played began to notice his absence during the day, and his physical condition seemed to be deteriorating rapidly. His face grew pale and gaunt, his hands shook when he played, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he was not sleeping. Concerned, the head priest, a wise and compassionate man, visited Hōichi at his home. "Hōichi," the priest said gently, "you have not been yourself lately. What troubles you?" At first, Hōichi was reluctant to speak of his strange encounters. He feared that the priest would not believe him, or worse, that he would anger the spirits by revealing their secret. But the priest was persistent, and finally Hōichi relented. He told the priest everything: the late-night visits, the ghostly audience, and the commanding voice that seemed to come from a long-dead warrior. The priest listened intently, his face growing more serious with each passing moment. When Hōichi had finished, the priest sat in silence for a long time, contemplating what he had heard. "My dear Hōichi," the priest said at last, "you have been playing for the dead. The spirits of the Heike, still bound to this world by their tragic fate, have taken a liking to your music. They are using you to relive their story, to keep their memory alive. But this is dangerous. If you continue to play for them, they will claim your life, just as the sea claimed theirs." Hōichi's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but to hear it confirmed by the priest filled him with dread. "What can I do?" Hōichi asked, his voice trembling. The priest stood and placed a comforting hand on Hōichi's shoulder. "Do not worry, my friend. There is a way to protect you, but you must trust me and do exactly as I say." That evening, as the sun set over Akama, the priest and his assistants came to Hōichi's house. They brought with them brushes and bowls of ink, and as Hōichi sat still and silent, the priest began to paint sacred sutras across his body. The ink, black and cold, formed intricate patterns on his skin. ancient prayers meant to ward off evil spirits and protect the living from the grasp of the dead. When the priest had finished, Hōichi's body was covered from head to toe in the sacred text, save for his ears, which had been overlooked in the process. "These sutras will protect you," the priest said. "Tonight, when the spirits come for you, remain silent. Do not play for them, no matter what they say. They will not be able to see you as long as you stay quiet." Hōichi nodded, though fear gripped his heart. He had faced the spirits night after night, but the thought of defying them terrified him. Still, he trusted the priest, and he knew that he could not continue as he had. That night, as Hōichi sat in the darkness, waiting for the spirits to arrive, he could hear the distant tolling of the temple bells and the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. His biwa lay untouched at his side, and his hands, still trembling, rested in his lap. Soon he heard the familiar sound of heavy footsteps approaching his door. "Hōichi!" the deep voice called out. "It is time! My master commands you to play!" But Hōichi remained silent, his heart pounding in his chest. The priest's words echoed in his mind. "Do not speak. Do not play." Again, the voice called out, this time more insistent. "Hōichi, do not make us wait. Play for us!" Still, Hōichi did not move. His lips pressed tightly together, and he held his breath, willing the spirits to pass him by. There was a long, tense silence, and then, to Hōichi's horror, the door creaked open. He could feel the cold presence of the spirit standing in the doorway, searching for him. "Where is Hōichi?" the voice growled. "He was here." The spirit moved through the room, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. Hōichi could feel the presence drawing closer, could feel the icy breath of the dead warrior on his skin. His heart raced, and every muscle in his body tensed as he tried to remain still. The spirit, unable to see Hōichi's body covered in sutras, became confused. But then its gaze fell upon Hōichi's ears, which had been left unprotected. "Ah," the spirit said, "there you are." Before Hōichi could react, he felt a searing pain as the spirit grabbed hold of his ears and tore them from his head. The pain was excruciating, and Hōichi bit down on his lip to keep from crying out. The spirit, satisfied that it had found part of Hōichi, departed, leaving the musician bleeding and trembling in the darkness. Chapter 6. The Legend of Hōichi the Earless. When the priest returned the next morning, he found Hōichi collapsed on the floor, his ears missing but his life spared. The sutras had worked, the spirits had been unable to see him, but because his ears had been left unprotected, they had become the spirit's target. The priest, horrified by what had happened, quickly bandaged Hōichi's wounds and tended to him as best he could. Though Hōichi survived the ordeal, he was forever changed. His ears were gone, and with them a piece of his soul seemed to have been taken by the spirits. From that day forward, Hōichi was known as Hōichi the Earless. Though he could no longer hear the music he played, his skill with the biwa remained unmatched, and his reputation as a musician only grew. People came from all over Japan to hear him perform, and his story became legend. It was said that Hōichi, despite his loss, found a sense of peace in the years that followed. He no longer played for the spirits of the hiker, but he continued to honor their memory through his music, reminding the living of the tragedies of the past and the weight of history. And so, dear listener, as you drift further into the world of ancient Japan, let the tale of Hōichi the Earless guide you into peaceful sleep. His story, like the music of the biwa, carries with it the echoes of the past and the quiet resilience of the human spirit. The Spirit of the Samurai Code, Bushido. Chapter 1. The Origins of Bushido. In the mist-shrouded mountains of ancient Japan, where the winds whispered through bamboo groves and the cherry blossoms fell like soft rain, a code of honor was born. It was a code that would shape the lives and deaths of countless warriors, a set of principles that transcended mere combat and guided men on the path of virtue, loyalty, and duty. This was Bushido, the way of the warrior. To understand the origins of Bushido, one must first journey back to the time of the samurai, the elite warrior class who ruled Japan for centuries. The samurai were not just soldiers. They were a class of men who lived by a strict code of ethics, one that placed honor above all else. This code, passed down from generation to generation, was more than a set of rules. It was a way of life, a philosophy that shaped the very fabric of Japanese society. Bushido's roots can be traced to a time of great turmoil during the Heian period, when Japan was still ruled by the imperial court, and the country was fractured by constant warfare. The samurai arose from the need for strong, disciplined warriors who could protect the land from invaders and internal strife. But as the samurai grew in power and influence, they began to develop a code that went beyond mere martial prowess. They sought a path of moral righteousness, one that would distinguish them from common soldiers and elevate them to a higher purpose. At its core, Bushido was a synthesis of several spiritual and philosophical traditions, including Shintoism, Confucianism, and Zen Buddhism. From Shintoism, the samurai drew a deep reverence for nature, the land, and the spirits of their ancestors. From Confucianism, they inherited the values of loyalty, duty, and filial piety, principles that emphasized the importance of relationships and the responsibilities that came with them. And from Zen Buddhism, they learned the importance of discipline, mindfulness, and the acceptance of death. This blend of spiritual teachings formed the foundation of Bushido, creating a code that was both practical and profound. It taught the samurai how to live and how to die. For the samurai, death was not something to be feared, but embraced as a natural part of life. To die in service to one's lord or in defense of one's honor was the ultimate expression of Bushido. But Bushido was not just about death. It was about how one lived. It emphasized virtues such as honesty, courage, compassion, and self-discipline. A samurai was expected to be not only a skilled warrior, but also a man of integrity, a protector of the weak, and a servant to his lord. His sword was not just a weapon, but a symbol of his honor and his commitment to the way of the warrior. As the centuries passed and Japan entered the era of the Kamakura shogunate, the code of Bushido became more formalized, with its principles enshrined in the hearts and minds of the samurai. It was during this time that the samurai truly came to embody the ideals of loyalty, honor, and sacrifice, and Bushido became the guiding force that shaped their lives. Chapter 2. Honor and Loyalty. At the heart of Bushido was the concept of honor, or meiyo. For the samurai, honor was everything. It was the foundation upon which his entire life was built. A samurai without honor was no better than a common criminal, and to lose one's honor was to lose one's very identity. But honor, in the context of Bushido, was not simply about personal pride or reputation. It was about living in accordance with one's values and upholding one's responsibilities, no matter the cost. A samurai's honor was tied to his loyalty, chugi, to his lord, his family, and his comrades. Without loyalty, there could be no honor, for a samurai's worth was measured by his commitment to those he served. The relationship between a samurai and his lord was one of deep mutual respect and obligation. The lord, or daimyo, provided the samurai with protection, land, and status, and in return, the samurai gave his life in service. This bond was sacred, and it was expected that a samurai would follow his lord's orders without question, even if it meant facing certain death. One of the most famous stories illustrating the principles of honor and loyalty in Bushido is the tale of the 47 ronin, a true story that took place in the early 18th century. It is a story that has been told and retold in countless forms, and it remains one of the most enduring examples of Bushido in action. The tale begins with a young lord named Asano Naganori, who was assigned to host an important official, Kira Yoshinaka, in Edo, modern-day Tokyo. Kira, a corrupt and arrogant man, insulted Asano repeatedly during the preparations, and in a moment of anger, Asano drew his sword and attacked Kira in the shogun's palace, an unforgivable act, as it was strictly forbidden to draw a weapon within the palace walls. Asano's attack failed, and he was immediately ordered to commit seppuku, ritual suicide. His lands were confiscated, and his samurai were left without a lord, becoming ronin, masterless warriors. But the samurai, led by Asano's chief retainer, Hōichi Yoshio, were determined to avenge their master's death. For 2 years, the ronin plotted their revenge, waiting for the right moment to strike. They lived in poverty, scattered and disguised, while Kira lived in comfort, believing he was safe from retribution. But on a snowy night in December, the 47 ronin stormed Kira's mansion, killed his guards, and finally beheaded Kira himself. Having avenged their lord, the ronin knew they would face execution as their actions were against the law, but they had upheld their duty to their master and restored his honor. When they were ordered to commit seppuku, they did so with dignity, knowing they had fulfilled their obligations as samurai. The story of the 47 ronin became a symbol of the highest ideals of Bushido: loyalty, honor, and the willingness to sacrifice one's life for the sake of duty. It is a reminder that a samurai's worth was not measured by his victories in battle, but by his unwavering commitment to the code that governed his life. Chapter 3: Courage and Rectitude. Alongside honor and loyalty, 2 other virtues lay at the core of Bushido: courage, or yuki, and rectitude, or gi. These were the qualities that allowed a samurai to face danger without fear and to act with righteousness even in the most difficult of circumstances. Courage in the Bushido tradition was not merely the absence of fear. It was the ability to act in spite of fear, to stand firm in the face of overwhelming odds, and to confront death with a calm and resolute spirit. A samurai was expected to be fearless in battle, but his courage was also tested in other ways, in his willingness to make difficult decisions, to stand up for what was right, and to endure hardship with grace. Rectitude, or righteousness, was the moral compass that guided a samurai's actions. It was the ability to discern right from wrong and to act accordingly, even when it was difficult or dangerous to do so. Rectitude was about more than simply following rules. It was about living in accordance with the highest principles of justice and fairness. The combination of courage and rectitude gave the samurai a sense of inner strength and purpose that went beyond the physical demands of battle. It allowed them to face death without hesitation, for they knew that their actions were guided by a higher moral code. A famous example of these virtues can be found in the story of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a legendary samurai who lived during the late Heian period. Yoshitsune was known for his extraordinary courage in battle, leading his forces to victory in some of the most pivotal moments of the Genpei War. But it was his sense of righteousness, his unwavering commitment to justice, that set him apart from other warriors. Yoshitsune's story, like that of many great samurai, ended in tragedy. Betrayed by his half-brother Minamoto no Yoritomo, Yoshitsune was forced to flee for his life. Yet even in exile, pursued by enemies, and facing certain death, Yoshitsune remained true to the code of Bushido. He refused to compromise his honor or abandon his sense of duty, and in the end, he chose to take his own life rather than allow himself to be captured. Yoshitsune's life and death serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of courage and rectitude in the Bushido tradition. It was not enough for a samurai to be skilled in combat. He had to live with integrity, to act with courage and righteousness, and to face death with dignity. Chapter 4. Compassion and Benevolence. While Bushido is often associated with the fierce and uncompromising warrior spirit of the samurai, it also placed great emphasis on the virtues of compassion, jin, and benevolence, rei. These qualities were considered essential for a true warrior, for it was believed that strength without kindness was meaningless. A samurai was expected to protect the weak, to show mercy to his enemies, and to act with generosity toward those in need. Compassion was not seen as a sign of weakness, but as a reflection of inner strength. It took courage to show kindness in a world often dominated by violence and conflict, and a samurai's ability to balance strength with compassion was a mark of his moral character. One of the most famous samurai known for his compassion was Uesugi Kenshin, a warlord who lived during the Sengoku period. Kenshin was a formidable warrior and one of the most powerful daimyo of his time, but he was also known for his deep sense of justice and his concern for the welfare of the people. During his campaigns, Kenshin often went out of his way to protect the civilians caught in the crossfire of war. He would provide food and shelter for those who had lost their homes, and would punish any of his soldiers who mistreated the local population. His reputation for fairness and compassion earned him the nickname the God of War, not just because of his military prowess, but because of his commitment to righteousness and mercy. Kenshin's rivalry with another famous daimyo, Takeda Shingen, provides a striking example of Bushido's emphasis on compassion and benevolence. Despite being bitter enemies on the battlefield, Kenshin and Shingen shared a deep mutual respect. On one occasion, when Shingen's forces were suffering from a severe shortage of salt, Kenshin, knowing that Shingen's people were suffering, sent him a shipment of salt. He did this not as a gesture of friendship, but because he believed it was wrong to exploit his enemy's misfortune. This act of generosity became legendary, and it exemplifies the spirit of Bushido's compassion. For Kenshin, defeating Shingen on the battlefield was one thing, but allowing innocent people to suffer unnecessarily was dishonorable. His actions showed that even in the heat of war, a samurai could and should remain guided by principles of humanity and benevolence. Chapter 5. Self-discipline and perseverance. Self-discipline, shitsujitsu, and perseverance, nin, were among the most prized virtues in the Bushido code, for they were the qualities that allowed a samurai to endure hardship and maintain his honor through the most difficult trials. A samurai was expected to master his own desires and impulses, to show restraint and control in all things, and to remain steadfast in the pursuit of his goals. Training in the way of the sword or any of the martial arts was a lifelong journey for the samurai. It required not only physical strength, but mental fortitude, a samurai's ability to remain calm in the face of danger, to control his emotions even in the heat of battle, and to stay focused on his duty regardless of the obstacles he faced, were all reflections of his self-discipline. Perseverance, too, was a central aspect of Bushido. Life as a samurai was filled with challenges, from the rigors of battle to the complexities of court politics. A samurai had to be resilient, able to endure pain, loss, and hardship without faltering. To persevere was to continue along the path of Bushido, even when it seemed impossible to succeed. The story of Miyamoto Musashi, perhaps the most famous swordsman in Japanese history, is a testament to the power of self-discipline and perseverance. Musashi was not born into privilege, nor was he a member of the samurai elite. Yet through sheer determination and an unrelenting commitment to mastering his craft, he became a legendary figure, undefeated in over 60 duels. Musashi's life was one of constant self-improvement. He was known for his ascetic lifestyle, spending years living in isolation in the mountains, training his mind and body. He practiced tirelessly, not only with the sword, but also in the arts of calligraphy, painting, and Zen meditation. His book, The Book of Five Rings, remains a classic on strategy and martial philosophy, and it reflects the deep self-discipline that guided his life. For Musashi, the way of the sword was not just about defeating opponents. It was about mastering oneself. His ability to remain calm under pressure, to adapt to any situation, and to persevere in the face of overwhelming odds made him a symbol of the Bushido spirit. Chapter 6. The Spirit of Bushido in the Modern World. Though the age of the samurai has long passed, the spirit of Bushido continues to influence Japanese culture and philosophy. The principles of honor, loyalty, courage, and self-discipline remain central to the way many Japanese people live their lives, and the legacy of the samurai can be seen in everything from modern martial arts to business ethics. In many ways, Bushido has transcended its origins as a code for warriors and has become a universal philosophy that speaks to the human condition. Its emphasis on living with integrity, acting with compassion, and facing life's challenges with courage and perseverance resonates with people from all walks of life, regardless of their background or profession. Even in the modern world, where the samurai are long gone, the virtues of Bushido continue to inspire those who seek to live with honor and purpose. In times of crisis, the spirit of Bushido reminds us to remain calm and resolute, to act with kindness toward others, and to stay true to our values, no matter the cost. And so, dear listener, as you drift further into the world of ancient Japan, let the spirit of Bushido guide you into peaceful sleep. The code of the samurai, though born in a time of war and conflict, carries with it a timeless message of honor, compassion, and perseverance, a message that continues to echo through the ages.